Hello, I'm Mark Allen from Gaper.io, and I'm here today with the co-founder and COO of ViaCustomers, Greg Woodfield. How you doing today, Greg?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad you could make it. So to get started, could you share a brief background of yourself and your work experience?
Yeah. I'm a co-founder, like you'd mentioned, in a software startup. Before I got into this, I was working for like an insurance company as managing reps all across the nation in like a hedge fund out of Hawaii. Graduated from Weber State University here in Utah and had uh, a good opportunity to be a student body president there. That's just a little bit about me. I guess as far as like the overall background, love to fish out here in Utah. That's where I'm located. It's one of my pastimes and love to spend time with my family.
That's great. So what has been your experience with remote employment, both as a remote employee and a remote employer?
So it's actually really interesting because a lot of our work is mostly done via Zoom chat or it's done, remotely. Um, with that being said, sorry, my son's trying to come through. Right
No problem.
So embarrassed. Sorry. One sec. Hey, Courtney. Thank you. All right. Perfect. Sorry.
Okay.
But just kind of resurfacing back to the question. It's been really interesting because most of our stuff is done already online anyways through Zoom and like phone calls. I'd probably say like from an employer perspective, it's how well do your employees manage their own expectations when they're not in like a cohesive working environment, right? Like where, there's a reason why we go to our office is because usually you want to separate those two out because there are distractions at home and, whether it's a kid knocking on your door and screaming, daddy, daddy, right? Or it may be something different. It can be kind of challenging. And so just with our experience and our employees is, it's been a lot more, I'd say, frequent conversations. So that's a little bit different to where, when you're in an office, it makes it really easy to say, hey, Mike, or hey, Felipe, or hey, Kimmy. It makes it super easy to be able to chat with them, but it can make it kind of difficult to jump on a Zoom really quick where they may be working in the middle of something. So it's just really just refining our communication patterns and trying to set that up. So I'd say that's as an employer getting used to that. But as an employee, I could kind of see it being, it is different for you because you've never been put in a situation, or maybe you have, where like our employees never have been in a remote space, right? So now you're taking your work home. And so, kind of going through that learning curve of creating a dedicated workspace and dedicated working hours and knowing, what to do during those hours. I mean, the autonomy is still there, but it's very different when, literally you have access to your whole house and it's your comfort zone, it's your relaxed zone, so it's just kind of monitoring that for themselves has been kind of the topic of discussion as we've talked about how you've been doing with the remote move over. And so, yeah, that's kind of what we've seen so far.
All right, cool. So what do you think is the future of remote employment? And what do you think needs to be done differently to make it better and more effective?
I think that, the future of remote employment is so important. I have a lady, when we went through a cohort or accelerator in our startup, and she owns a remote workforce called Instant Teams. It's kind of interesting, but when we were with them, the whole idea and their philosophy was working with military spouses. They kind of found this niche to where instead of outsourcing, your workforce, it's outsourcing it into the United States. Not saying outsourcing is bad, but they wanted to kind of outsource to, these military spouses who were at home, with their husband or wife, partner, or whatever it may be. They wanted to give them opportunities. And so they found a niche, and their whole workforce, from facilitating a software to facilitating payroll and all that kind of stuff through remote teams, is kind of their niche. And so it's been interesting because, I've been calling upon her expertise because it is so new, right, for us, and so I think that, the future of like the workforce and what that looks like would be, having a dedicated space in case there was something that you would need to do. I feel like a big change in virtual meetings is going to be kind of the topic. I feel like it's now forcing people who had no clue about Zoom or Google Hangouts. I think it's forcing them to learn a new way of communication. And then I think that there's going to be a lot of new companies that spawn because of remote workforces, and that's where like kind of Slack comes into play. Slack has always been a huge, thing for us. And I feel like it's just, what could we better about our communication, right? What could we do to better our streamlined and our software tools that we're using? And it kind of makes you realize where you want to really put your priorities on what's the most important thing when you're not having access to, your employees, so quickly. And so I would just say that communication is probably going to be the biggest change that I think will take place in remote workforces and how it's done. It's kind of interesting, but I feel like the future is going to be relying heavily on companies who've already done it. Mm-hmm. And I think the future will be very much communication heavy on how we communicate from employee to employer, employer to employee, and then like whether that's HR, IT, and how that communication all works. So it is streamlined because it'll be very easy for things to kind of get dropped through the cracks. And so I could see a lot of companies spawning because of that. And then also, a lot of changes in that specific area.
And I think you're already starting to see that happen out in the marketplace. And I mean, Zoom's a perfect example. Like I would say at least half of the population had never used Zoom before these last 2 weeks. And
yeah.
I think almost all of, I'd say 80 to 90% of us have now.
Yeah.
Even my mother, my 90-year-old mother got on Zoom.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that because like for me, like, my mom, like even just communicating to like, her book club, right? Or mm-hmm. different things like that. It's unique, but I think it's exposing the world to where maybe I would say the biggest change that will take place will be in events and conferences, which will be a very interesting dynamic when trade shows are so popular amongst scaling SaaS companies and tech companies. I still think the major ones will probably take place, but I feel like where it's kind of now given you the option where it's like, hey, now we're hosting this big event virtual, right? I think that it's going to cut down on spend for companies when they ship people out to these trade shows. And, so it'll be interesting to see how the trade show and event market works specifically in the tech field.
Yeah.
And if people go more virtual and subscription based and, hey, pay us for the content and then we'll record it and send it to you. So
yeah, actually I think things like, you're right, things like CES will still happen, but I know AWS is already doing a lot of remote stuff. I mean, they'd already started it. I think this will just streamline it even more.
Yeah, I agree. We were going to go to SaaStr, but SaaStr, they were telling us that it was going to be closed. And so, my father-in-law, he's a, CIO at a bank, and he and all of his conferences where he goes, to Germany and kind of different places, it's interesting because he's telling me, he's like, I feel like this is going to be a good excuse for a lot of these big corporations, to say, hey, we're moving more virtual now instead of, spending that money, where I think a lot of people really miss that. I'm not sure if it'll ever really go away, but I think people are going to start to think twice about events,
Yeah. So, but I also think too, travel will be different. People will have jobs for the same company in different cities. And like, let's say the city, the company's based in Chicago, the people will come into Chicago instead of people in Chicago or different parts going to Vegas for a conference.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree with that. I think, with my brother-in-law, he works for a company out in the Bay and he's a, regional sales manager over there. And it's interesting because he has to travel to meet with people, right? But not meet with people. Like it may sound weird, but meeting with his people, his team members, right? To kind of build that, connection to the company. So I think that's essential to where I don't think that's going to really disappear.
Right.
But I would say like where we're going to see it, my own opinion would seeing a big swing would be in the meeting aspect with, contacts, whether that be, contacts with doctors, contacts with, mid-market people, I think a lot of them are just going to be like, oh, this is an amazing tool. Why are we spending all this money on travel to go and communicate or do this? Where it's like, let's spend the money on our company, our employees, our perks,
right,
and not put it into this big travel expense to where I think the Zoom CEO, he spoke recently at Silicon Slopes, and he wasn't there. Right? He was on Zoom, and he said that he's only been on a plane, like I think it was like 3 or 4 times. And I thought that was fascinating considering, his billion-dollar company and multi-billion-dollar company, that he's created. It's kind of interesting to think that he's already setting the precedence of you don't need to go to all these meetings around the world. It's just focus on your company and have meetings on Zoom.
Yeah, it's great. So what's the story behind ViaCustomers and what's the journey been like?
Yeah, so ViaCustomers is a customer engagement platform for e-commerce businesses, specifically Shopify stores. So the whole idea behind it is we connect to Shopify and then we facilitate the marketing aspects from like abandoned carts, sending messages, direct messages like through SMS, and then all other messenger platforms such as like Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and then kind of facilitating the back end of customer service, very similar to a Zendesk, but through SMS. And so we try to build relationships on the devices and networks that people use most often, the way that people build relationships with each other, which typically we kind of believe that, email is like an incumbent to communication when you're talking to a customer, even though it's needed. I feel like your open rates are so much better through messaging platforms. And so me and my business partner, the CEO, Tejas Kanduru, one of my best friends, we met 7 years ago on a ski trip. Oddly enough, he was going to BYU at the time. He graduated in finance and went on and went and worked for Wall Street for a bank called Credit Suisse. And then I went on and did my thing. And then we kind of basically mutually said, hey, like we want to start something one day. You kind of have the sales and operation background, and then he has like the tech and finance background. And I think we'd work really, really well together. And so we quit our jobs, as most tech founders do, and coded the software, started, kind of trying to find, good product market fit. We got accepted into an accelerator. We raised some capital as a pre-seed through 4 other investors who are advisors in our company as well. And, that was about a year ago since we've been taking payments from clients. We raised that money through investors, about $750,000 as a pre-seed. We only had $1,700 in revenue, and we knew that we had a very specific vision and a very big drive. And I would explain entrepreneurship and this entrepreneurship, and my business partner coined it best when he said, it's like being on a roller coaster, but you never know where the drops are. It's fun, it's exciting, it's exhilarating, it's exhausting. You're putting in a lot of hours to make it work. Working with the right people is very important. And then we went to Hawaii. We went to another accelerator called Blue Startups out there. After that, we more than, doubled our revenue. We're now at about 49,000 roughly a month in recurring revenue as a company. So encroaching up to $1 million ARR, where most people are trying to raise like a seed, right? Or an early Series A. And so we're now at this stage where, we're not really in the need to raise just because we are profitable as a company. So we're kind of looking at it to where it's like, how long do we want to go before we are, deploying capital and scaling our company? And so Via is just in a unique position. We have 13 employees right now, of which, we have 6 remote working in Utah. And then we have the majority out in the Bay. And then we've outsourced a couple of customer success reps out in the Philippines. And so we've tried to do our best in just kind of making sure that we understand the vision and we're growing as a company and, treating our employees as our best asset. So that's kind of the goal and the vision of Via and kind of where we're at today.
Great. So seeing how you're a new company, how did you initially incorporate the idea of remote in your company?
So it was kind of hard because like, like I'm on Zoom chat all the time or Zoom all the time with, my developers in the Bay, and then they're on with us and talking about the product, and everybody's just, I mean, we're working remotely, I guess you could say, company to company. We're not building two separate companies because we don't want to build two separate cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're doing is we're saying, hey, we need to be in consistent communication. And so we've been doing it for a long time. So the transition wasn't that hard. What was hard is telling my employees who have built these relationships and enjoyed the vision, enjoyed working with each other, and then to say, hey, for the foreseeable future until, the outbreak of COVID kind of, I wouldn't say diminishes, but gets to a point where, people feel safe in going back to work and whatever it may be. I just kind of looked and said, at what point is being prepared to where it's like I had like, hand sanitizer and vitamin C and all of this stuff to make sure my employees were taken care of. But at the same time, we want to make sure that they're safe. And, the whole idea was, you can spread this to other people who are, older class of you or whatever it may be. And so me and my business partner made the mutual decision to say, I think it's best that everybody works remotely. And so being a new company, that was definitely a challenge for us to make sure everybody was like set up properly. Did they have a dedicated workspace? If not, like, is there some way that we could facilitate like a private room somewhere that was easier or something, and so it took us a minute to kind of get our feet on the ground. But I feel like where we're operating now, it's just, we've focused really heavily in communication is, reporting in the morning, talking about, the end of the day activities, like what you've done, where you're going, what incumbents or what impedes your goals. And it has been a very consistent communication. And it's weird because I feel like I'm communicating a lot on Zoom, but in reality, you don't realize how much you communicate as a business to different entities of your business in one day. I think it's just something that you don't really realize that you're doing, but when you do it, it now is like, oh man, like I've only had 3 Zoom calls with my employees today, right? And what's going on? But I think when you have high trust in the people that you work with, and you can kind of see from output perspective of what outputs are being made by the individual person, I think you can see how they care about the company, and I think there could be a lot of companies who are much larger than we are. And I feel fortunate to be a smaller company in this time period, because I couldn't imagine being an Apple right now, or an Android, or, a large company, and having to tell, 49 to 100,000 employees, hey, you have to work from home and you have to figure out how to do it. And I couldn't imagine being an engineer and working on a project and being like, well, I don't have any of my tools at home. And so how do I progress the company's vision, but I'm limited to what I need to do? And I think it really, really pushes down on the creative thinking of people. And I think it opens new doors to creative freedom, but I also think it may clench a lot of people and hurt a lot of people because they just don't have access to the things that they need to grow. And I think that's where new, I would say, companies will spawn out of is, hey, we solve this problem for you. So we're a remote team that does engineering, that has in this, but we figured it out, right? So,
well, then, since you brought up the pandemic that's going on, a lot of companies have been forced to go remote on very short notice, and you seem to have already had a plan for that in place from day one. But what challenges do you think these other companies are that really had no concept of it before these last 2 weeks?
Yeah, to be honest, I think the challenge is that it was so sudden, and I don't think anything prepares you. So it's, what can you do in the now? And what can you do right now that makes you a asset to the company? Because the way that a lot of these bigger companies, and I know that a lot of them have, try to support their employees and not do layoffs, but there's, mid-market companies where they utilize this as a perfect layoff time, which is just, in my opinion, it's atrocious. It's just take out a loan, right? And pay off the loan, take care of your employees. Like, they're here for you. They want to work for you, work with them, right? Like, care for them, like, it's your responsibility. And so I think the challenge is with people who, don't know how they truly provide value with maybe working on something like I could think of like auto mechanics, for example, right? Like, you know, where it could be in like a Toyota situation where like you're working on cars. Most of that stuff is like, you know, robotics that's putting stuff together. But, you know, I imagine there's thousands of people that are still among the assembly lines, right? Tesla and all these other places to where they are forced to shut down in a time where it was such growth, right? In such a bull market. Whereas now the bear market of things is we're in this interesting thing together. So I would just say with big companies, I think it's how do you make the most of the situation? How do you adapt? And then how do you execute as you adapt? To where for us, we are small enough to where I can have those communications. It can be quick. We can adjust and we can move forward and still be successful as a company. But I think with other people, I mean, that's very difficult when you're communicating down from the top to 49,000 employees. And people are in fear for their jobs. They're not focused on working. And so I think when you look at how do you focus, how do you become an asset now, how do you adapt, and then how do you clearly communicate what you're working on every day, how you're adding value to the company. And if you can do that, I feel like it eases that managers, that bosses, that CEO's burden of saying, I want to keep all these people employed, but how long is this going to last? And I need to make sure that I myself am providing the easiest way of communication to these people.
Very good. So there are companies like Gaper that help develop, build, and scale products, especially for startups. How important do you think this will be going forward for founders like yourself that you need to hire quality people and quickly?
So I think people who weren't prepared, right? And what I mean is like, you know, I've learned a lot of lessons, you know, growing a company just for a year. But I've learned, right? I mean, I still have a lot of battle scars to go through, but you kind of earn a lot of battle scars just in a small period of time over a long period of time. And you learn what not to do. And I think what you learn what not to do is you don't want to hire a person who isn't competent or confident in the role that they can assume. And so, you know, whether it's using Gapier or some other, you know, outsourced company or whatever it may be to kind of build scale products, you know, remote teams, all of that, right? Like, I think you want to go with somebody who has pre-vetted this person or this individual that you kind of are deploying Minutemen, right? Or women in this process that it's like, you know, you can deploy them and instantly I have somebody that I know I can rely on because they've already been doing remote work, or maybe they're freelancers or whatever it may be. I feel like in a situation where there are going to be roadblocks, it's why put another roadblock on a person who's never done it before. Where, you know, scaling and doing, you know, what you guys are doing, I think it makes complete sense for businesses who need services to go to people who have already kind of built that. And it's like, well, this is second nature to us. This is what we do. You know, this is how you do it. And then it kind of calms the nerves of people who are like, oh my goodness, like I need this, or I need this, and I just lost this. And that's where like adaptive, you know, companies like, you know, Gapier or, you know, other companies can really succeed.
Yeah, I think the thing we noticed is in order for it to be successful, remote development, like remote teams, it's all in the setup. If you do a good setup, it usually goes pretty smoothly. And that's where we really come in, is we help. A lot of companies don't know how to get the setup right.
Yeah.
Right. And once you do that, it's kind of like building the foundation of a house. Once you do that, it's pretty solid.
Yeah.
So Greg, this has been great. I'd like to thank you for your time today, and I wish ViaCustomers all the luck in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Appreciate it, Mark. Take care.
Bye.